In the years 2013 and 2014, I remember those years being the beginning of my journey with the Souls series, as well as the Souls-like genre that we know today. But during those times, I was left wanting for something else to fill the void after playing through and loving the first Dark Souls. It was a game that opened up a whole new pathway for me. It made me appreciate difficult and challenging games for the first time, showing me that hard games could be fun. In 2014, we would get a sequel to the first game, which is the most divisive of the bunch. Personally, I love Dark Souls 2, and I do look forward to talking about it one day. But again, I was still waiting for other experiences, and I thought I would find it in games like Tokiden, Monster Hunter, Dragon's Dogma, or Soul Sacrifice, games that had big bosses and, engaging combat, but on a fundamental level, they're nothing at all like Dark Souls and never have been. I wanted more big boss fights, more rolling and epic music in the same spirit as Dark Souls and Demon Souls. But again, in the early years, there really wasn't anything else, which made those games unique and truly stand out from the other action RPG games at the time. Eventually though, a new game would be announced by a different studio that not only presented a game that had exactly what I wanted, but would spearhead the Souls-like genre that permeates the action RPG and hack and slash genre today, Lords of the Fallen. To my knowledge, this would be the first game to have the term Souls-like associated to it, or at least the earliest Souls-like game. Souls-like are games that emulate the formula of the Souls games made by From Software and take certain aspects like animation priority, stamina-based combat, character creation, freedom in weapon builds, cryptic and deep world building, and dark and grim settings. Lords of the Fallen was the first game I experienced to be like Dark Souls at the time, in a period where, again, there wasn't really anything else to be seen. It was made by Deck 13 and C1 Games, and it would set itself in a snowy and desolate fortress, overtaken by demonic forces known as the Rogar, and you, in Souls fashion, will be rolling, blocking, and managing your stamina through regular enemies and bosses, but as a criminal named Harkin who would undertake this suicidal mission in the promise of having his sins removed, evidenced by the marks on his face. Contrast to the more snappy gameplay of Dark Souls, Lords of the Fallen would go for a slower but more weighted feel to its combat. Wearing different levels of armor or using different weapons would have a significant impact on your character's mobility and survival. Heavy armor made you take less damage, but you moved slower, and rolling was less than ideal. Medium is the best compromise and goes for a middle ground. Light armor lets you move and roll faster, but you take more damage. You had a variety of different weapons and a set of spells that you could assign, as well as the ability to shield bash or use the gauntlet, another utility-based weapon that you could use. You see, at this point, the Souls games had been rising in popularity around this time. Dark Souls was the successful counterpart of Demon Souls, and Lords of the Fallen was the start of a new wave of games made to play and feel like Dark Souls. For its time, it was a decent effort, albeit with some significant flaws, but it was a starting point for other studios to take notes and try to make their own Souls-like experience. At the time that I played it, I enjoyed it. I liked its weighty feel initially, its dark fantasy metal aesthetics in the environments, with some decent boss fights with multiple phases, and the lore was somewhat interesting too, but upon revisiting it again, it's a game that has not aged very well, especially in today's Souls-like climate where there's so many other options now, and my opinion of the game as a result has lessened over time. The game had the benefit of being one of the few Souls-likes available in the early years. In fact, back in 2014, there wasn't really anything else besides Dark Souls and Demon Souls, and at this point we were yet to see better alternatives, like the Neo games, Salt and Sanctuary, the Surge titles, and Lies of P that would come years later. Nowadays, it has to contend with all of those games, and in comparison, the game just isn't that good anymore. The bosses are unique in their function, but there's nothing really memorable about them, especially when you contrast it with the bosses in the Souls series, where they had a elegant appearance compounded with a name and history that made them very memorable. The Rogar Lords are just big baddies to kill. Sure, they're unique between each other and how they look and function, but besides that, there's nothing really memorable about them. The combat is just not as enjoyable anymore. It's very sluggish, it's clunky, and it becomes more of a drag later on, and a lot of the times you're left to being attacked during mid-combo as well. While it's tied with the story, Not having a customizable character to create aside from armor and weapons was another thing that limited its freedom. Nowadays, it's a game that I would recommend under specific circumstances, but overall, you wouldn't really be missing out on anything. In fact, I would recommend playing the Surge games instead, that were made by the same studio. They feel much more focused, and they seem to have a much better idea of what experience they wanted to convey. Fast forward to 2023, and Lords of the Fallen would finally make a return. But not only with a new coat of paint, but also as a completely different game. When I first saw this game, I thought it was going to be a reboot, and it really showed. From the trailer to the gameplay, it looked like a bigger and far more realized version of the original, and it wasn't even made by the same studio. And after about 40 hours of playtime with this game, I can say that it certainly is that, a much better version of the original game. Lords of the Fallen, the 2023 version, is one of those games that came out initially with a lot of issues, especially in the technical department. But underneath that broken surface was one of the most solid Souls-like games that I've played so far, with a fair amount of things going for it. The mixed reception of it is not completely unwarranted though. It had some serious performance issues at launch, and when I first booted it up, I was really worried. But once I limited the FPS, turned DLSS on, and set super resolution to balance, my worries were alleviated with smooth gameplay. I can't say that everyone will have the same outcome, but if it does work out, then you'll be able to appreciate what the game does bring to the table. As for the game itself, it's a massive improvement over the original game. A much more detailed and beautiful world to explore with a variety of different environments, character creation, lots of different armor sets and weapons for the Fashion Souls community, richer lore and story elements, and far better boss fights. Of course though, I do have some big gripes with it. Things that do hold the game back and stop it from being the top for me. But this is still a pretty good Souls-like, and I'll get more into it. But before I do, I will say something about the Souls-like genre in general, and what to expect from them. The thing is that over the years the quality has varied, but they've never reached the From Software level of quality, even though some have come really close, like the Nioh titles or Lies of P, which is why I can be somewhat forgiving in this particular genre. I understand that the vast majority of these games are made with smaller teams, with smaller budgets, and different engines as well, so you do kind of have to have a more realistic expectation of what kind of quality to expect from these games. But the existence of said games is something that I do appreciate because they do try to invoke something that has been a big part of my gaming life, but with their own ideas and mechanics involved in it. Lords of the Fallen 2023 is more along the lines of Dark Souls 1 and 2 in both its style of gameplay, its overall map design, the interconnectivity of the locations, as well as the approach to fighting enemies and bosses. Now, for whether it's a reboot or not, well, it's actually a sequel game, and this is confusing because they both virtually have the same name. It sets itself about 1,000 years after the events of the original, set in the land of Mornstead, where the beacons reaching the sky are placed to keep the dark god Adir from returning to the mortal realm, and for a while this plan was working. The judges behind the new age would then create new orders to uphold the new world and keep it in check. But in Souls fashion, things would go to shit. The beacons would then become corrupt, and the Rogar swarmed the land, corrupting and destroying everything in their path, which is where the lamp bearers come in. Basically, they are people who carry a lamp that prevents death, so that they can continue their struggle to restore the beacons back to a purified state. Of course though, it's easier said than done, as you will see in the intro where one of them gets absolutely bodied by a four-armed demon. Before the paladin gets killed in the intro, he throws a lamp into a pit of corpses, which is where our character comes in and is brought back to life, thus beginning our journey in the game, through the character creation system. Games like the original Lords of the Fallen or Sekiro have a preset character that are intrinsically tied with the game's storyline. And to a degree, it's the same here, but the difference is that the lamp could have picked anybody. Anyone could theoretically fulfill the role of being the lamp bearer, which is why we're able to create our own character however we wish, even as a blue-coloured princess. Eventually you'll wander around, get introduced to the basic forms of exploration, combat, as well as the unique umbral mechanic that becomes an integral part of the experience. To explain it briefly, it lets you travel to an alternate realm with branching pathways, and means to get from one place to another, but the longer you stay in it, the more dangerous it becomes, making it a risk and reward experience. More on that later. You then face a tutorial boss and then another boss that you have no hope of beating unless you've played the game before. You get wrecked and then you wake up again, left to explore and progress through the rest of the game. The main goal of this game is to cleanse the 5 beacons in the world of Mornstead. To do this, you'll have to go through other bosses, endless ganks, umbral travels, as well as exploring each of the game's diverse range of areas. To start off, the game is gorgeous. The overall graphical detail powered by the Unreal Engine really brings it to life here in ways that the original game never could. Even with the game's centralized setting, each place and area is showered with lots of little details that tell a story of their own, from paintings to statues, even down to the evidence of brutality displayed by both the Rogar and the humans. In the original, you had one big snowy place to explore, as well as the pathway that also had snow. This game is more dynamic with its environments, to cliffside fortresses to swampy areas, my most hated area covered in snow, and a castle drenched in crystals and lava. The detail is very metal and epic in the dark fantasy fashion. It wasn't too far off from the same feeling that I had with Elden Ring, where the artists were allowed to embellish the world, scaling the environment and the world to a grand and epic degree. Both Elden Ring and this game have their worlds feel lifelike and huge, even with the grimdark status that they both find themselves in. It was refreshing to have different scenery to look forward to each time. It would be a lot better though if I weren't fighting the same enemies over and over again, and this is one of my biggest problems with the game. In fact, it's a problem that I have with both games. As you'll progress, the enemy roster doesn't change much, and by the end you'll still be fighting the same enemies as you did in the beginning, and some bosses actually become regular enemies, which will only make the experience even more tedious and repetitive. This overall made the exploration aspect tedious, which is a shame because the environments were beautiful. In the Souls games, each area had their own distinct challenges and enemies, making it exciting when you discover a new area. In this game, it's the same shit, different area, and I was getting tired of it eventually. And it's even worse in the Umbral realm because the roster of enemies in there is much smaller, which over time makes it a drag to even go through. You'll be using the Umbral mechanic mainly for navigating through areas that you can't get to in the Axiom realm, which is the realm of the living, finding unique bosses as well as grinding XP due to the boost that it provides. Like the Souls games, it has a traditional stat leveling system, weight management, as well as inventory to manage with weapons, items, amulets, things like that. Each stat contributes to your overall build of the character that you have. Speaking of builds, you have a diverse range of weapons from melee to range and magic, and this game gives you more choices than the original installment. Personally, I'm more of a melee person. I never really enjoyed using ranged or magic in the Souls games, which is why I usually go for pure melee builds in either dex or strength focused runs. Most of the game I would use dex based weapons, but towards the end I would settle for heavier weapons which would help in cheesing certain bosses. Speaking of the bosses, there were some really good boss fights in this game. Pieta, Judge Cleric, Light Reaper, Tancred, Spurned Progeny, the Sundered Monarch, and Harrower Dervla were some of my favourite fights in this game. The rest are a mixed bag, and some are just reskins of other enemies, as well as others like Paladin's Burden that were just an absolute slog to get through because of the OP healing that he had. The bosses were the better of the combat experience overall, whereas the general enemies were becoming just very repetitive to fight, and most of the time I would just run through areas just to quickly make a shortcut to the boss area, and then come back and explore more later. As for the combat itself specifically, it's much better this time around. It's faster, you can return health by guarding, a mechanic that was from Lies of P, parrying enemies to eventually land a devastating blow, as well as dodging, which by the way is much better too because of the iframes. However, the momentum that carries you forward with set attacks can be really annoying sometimes, and this issue is exacerbated with the enemies and the bosses, where a lot of the times they'll still hit you no matter how far you run. It's like having an invisible magnet attached to you and there's almost nothing you can do about it, which is why getting a handle on the parrying and the dodging mechanics is really important in this game. As for parrying itself, if you hold the block button just before you get hit, you'll negate the attack, while still taking a little bit of damage that you can easily get back because of the guard system. And if you do it enough times, you'll eventually stun the enemy, letting you go for a critical attack. It's, again, similar to Lies of P, but the main difference is that you don't have to do a strong attack to stun them or do a Fable attack to stun them. Lords of the Fallen also has a mechanic where, like I said, your health bar can be brought back up after blocking, which is the guard system. The grey area in the health bar means that you can recover that health by attacking, but if you get hit again, then you lose that health permanently unless you heal. And this is an important thing to understand in the umbral realm, because every time you travel, you'll lose half of your health, but you can get it back by attacking other enemies, or just by healing. However, you can't backstab in this game, which is disappointing, but I guess it was to avoid the exploitation of the staggering system that the enemies have. Part of what makes this game a bit more forgiving in comparison to other Souls-likes is the umbral system itself. Basically, when you die in the Axiom realm, you get transported to the umbral realm, which is like the game's underworld. It's a place you'll be visiting quite often, and it makes a significant change in the scenery and the environments. A lot of the times you'll be using it to access areas that you can't reach, and even certain optional bosses that you can't find in the Axiom world, like Paladin's Burden. It also kicks in during boss fights when you die the first time around, giving you a second chance to have at it. But when you die in both realms, you'll lose your currency, and you'll get a chance to get it back, like in the Souls games. But if you die a second time around in both realms, you lose it forever. Having two chances definitely made it a lot easier to get through some of the 2 health bar boss fights like Tancred and Dervla, because even if I fucked up in the fight and died, I still had that second life to keep it going. When it comes to the exploration itself, there's plenty to discover in both realms. And like in the Souls games, you have your equivalent of bonfires called vestiges, but these vestiges are of previous lamp bearers who have succumbed to their fate, and you are essentially using their remains to mark a checkpoint in the world. In between those vestiges and the boss areas, there is a lot of ground to cover. Too much, in fact, and some people have complained about the scarcity of checkpoints. Well, that's where the vestige seeds come in. Basically, the game lets you create your own bonfires. You get these items from killing some of the tougher umbral enemies or from beating a boss. To use them, you have to find a little area with a bed of flowers in a circle. You place the seed, and then you can use it as a checkpoint, called a seedling. This is great for creating your own shortcuts, especially for harder bosses where shortening the travel time is important. Plus, the mechanic gives you more agency in the world because you are creating your own path and your own shortcuts, and it's something that future Souls-likes should consider implementing. Compared to the original game, the story and the setting is much richer. There is a lot more lore to discover, and some of the characters have some pretty interesting backstories. In fact, the character from the first game is also in this one as well. He's the dude with the large beard and hammer that you meet early on. While I haven't delved too much into the game's story and lore, there is a really good channel that has gone into a lot of detail of the game's universe called the Librarians, who have covered games and stories and universes like Magic the Gathering, Dune, Lies of P, as well as Lords of the Fallen. And I would highly recommend checking this channel out if you're into the lore aspect of games. As for the story itself, it's decent enough to keep you going through the experience. It's a lot more interesting than the original, but that's also because they've taken more time to creating a richer world, and the new game has had the benefit of technical advancements in graphics as well as the years of Souls-likes that it can take ideas from. Now, there is in fact co-op and PvP in this game. I've yet to try either one, but given its rough launch and current player base, you'll have to play it at peak time to get more people on. It looks to be similar to the Souls games though, where you can go about the world together and fight bosses, which is where a lot of the co-op takes place anyways. PvP is something I've never invested too much time into, other than getting invaded by other people and winning some and losing some, but it's more or less the same deal in this game. Basically, you just go in with OP builds and smack people around, except that in Lords, the umbral mechanic still kicks in when you down an opponent, making it a round 2 kind of session. You can go into the multiplayer by going to your seedling or vestige. Co-op can be fun if you have someone to play with, and PvP seems to be fun when it works and when you can find enough action during peak hours. I don't really do too much PvP, but it's great that it's there for those that enjoy invading and making the game harder for other people. And the thing too is, you're not locked into it like you are in the Souls games when you're online. Unfortunately, you still can't pause the game, which has been my most hated thing in the Souls series. When you're playing online, I can understand this mechanic, but not when you aren't engaging with the game's multiplayer aspects and you're playing solo and offline. It should have been made so that if you're offline or playing solo, you can then pause the game whenever you want, unless you're engaging in co-op and PvP. Now, to be clear about the original Lords of the Fallen, I don't necessarily hate the game. It's just that the new game has basically spoiled the experience for me because of just how much better it is, really. The original game is something to try out if you haven't played the new one, but if you already have, then don't bother, because in comparison, it's a massive downgrade. The original game set the foundation for future Souls-likes to try their hand at emulating the Dark Souls formula. The 2023 version has had the influence of other titles like Elden Ring, Bloodborne, and Sekiro, affecting other Souls-likes that would in turn influence the new Lords of the Fallen game, and what we have is basically a far better version of the original. The new game is now one of my favorites, but of course it does have a lot of flaws, massive ones, like a lot of momentum in the animations, reuse enemies and bosses, taking the ganking aspect of Dark Souls 2 and making it worse, and a lack of communication in questing where progressing too much can make you miss out on quests that you didn't even know were there. And it's a common thing in Souls-likes as well as the Dark Souls games. But in saying that, that is where the New Game Plus aspect comes in, as well as the Restart Game Plus Zero mechanic, which is something different because it enables you to reset the game, but you still keep all your equipment and levels, without making the game harder through New Game Plus. As for magic, I never really used it in this game because, again, I'm not really a magic user, but the one thing it does infinitely better than Dark Souls is how you select magic. In the Souls games, you had to select individual spells, which made it clunky and tedious. But in Lords of the Fallen, you can hotkey multiple spells, making for more effective magic-based combat. From now and forever, every other Souls-like game needs to do the same thing as this game, letting you assign multiple spells at the same time, rather than tediously changing spells with the up directional pad just to use that spell. In summary, Lords of the Fallen 2023 is a really good Souls-like, with some bad flaws, but still a lot of other things going for it that make it a good game. It also had a horrible launch due to the technical issues that it faced, but those technical issues are getting ironed out each month. Some amazing games have had incredibly awful launches. Just look at Cyberpunk 2077, a game that was just a technical disaster. But after years of patching and updating, it is now one of the best open world RPGs ever made. In time, Lords of the Fallen will become more playable for other people, and future content I'm sure will make the game a lot richer as a result. And by that point, it'll be a much more stable game. Once again, it's a game that has some good things going for it, and if Hexworks takes the constructive criticism into account, I'm sure that they will bounce back with a sequel that improves on what this game already has done, as well as fixing certain mistakes that, shouldn't have been there in the first place. I would recommend giving this game a try if you're in the market for another Souls-like experience. Just expect some caveats along the way. And as for the original, if you're going to play both, start with that one first and see what it has to offer, but if you can only afford one, play the new Lords of the Fallen instead. Stay tuned and thank you for watching.